By devoting just 6 minutes each weekday for 1 year, you can read through the entire New Testament using David's servant's daily devotional, HeavenWord Daily. Order your copy at heavenword.tv.
Well, it's great to be with you once again as we continue our chronological study through the entire New Testament. Today, we're back in Matthew chapter 26, and Jesus has just been arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. Now we're going to move on to his trial. But before we do, I just want to mention one thing. We were pressed for time last time we were together. Matthew mentioned that as soon as Jesus was arrested, all of his disciples fled. Luke tells us that Peter was the only one who did kind of stand off in a distance and then follow from a distance as Jesus was led away. And Mark, interestingly enough, tells us this little story about a young man who was, for some reason, present, and I'm reading from Mark chapter 14, verse number 51, a young man was following him, wearing nothing but a linen sheet over his naked body. And they seized him. Well, so you can see that they weren't just trying to seize Jesus, they were trying to seize anyone who was associated with Jesus. That's why all the disciples ran for their lives. Verse number 52 of Mark 14 says, "But he pulled free of the linen sheet and escaped naked." And so there you have I guess the second recording of a streaker here in the Bible. I don't know why the guy wasn't wearing any undergarments, what he was doing there. All of this is a total mystery, who this guy was. Some scholars have suggested that this was Mark, because it's in Mark's gospel, and he was too embarrassed to tell his own name. Again, I don't see any real reason to say that. I don't see why Mark would have been wearing nothing but a linen sheet at that point in time in the Garden of Gethsemane, unless that's what he wore as his pajamas to sleep in, and he was just trying to make himself more comfortable. In any case, he escaped naked. I hope he found some clothes before sunrise the next day. Now, we come back to Matthew chapter 26, starting anew today in verse number 57. Those who had seized Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest. Remember, that's the guy who had the slave who helped the rest of those guys come to arrest Jesus in the garden, and Peter cut off his ear, and Jesus healed his ear. Where the scribes and the elders were gathered together. We think that this is, very early the next day, the day of Jesus' crucifixion, the cover of darkness. Matthew 26 and verse 59, "Now the chief priests and the whole council kept trying to obtain false testimony against Jesus so that they might put him to death." And so their whole goal is just to justify what they're gonna do. They want to kill him. They want him eliminated. And they just want to be able to tell people later on, well, we had reason to do it because of what he said or what he did. And so they're bringing, the witnesses in to give their testimonies, but all of their testimonies were inconsistent. We continue reading in verse number 60, "They did not find any, even though many false witnesses came forward. But later on, 2 came forward and said, 'This man stated, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days.'" As if that would be a crime worthy of death because somebody says something like that. Well, we all, of course, know that when Jesus said those words, he was speaking of the temple of his body and speaking of his resurrection 3 days later. And so even here at his trial, which any of those guys would have known, here's a man who's respected by multitudes as a prophet, who's worked miracles, who gives profound sermons and so forth. And so if he said something like that, he didn't mean it literally that he could destroy the temple of God, this massive edifice that took decades to build, that he could destroy it in 3 days, or that he could rebuild it in 3 days. Now, that could be considered a claim to be tantamount to claiming to be God, because only God could do such a thing as that literally. It'd be the realm of the uber miraculous. And so perhaps they're bringing it up to say, we're trying to pin you with a claim to be God, because we hear these rumors that that's really what you're claiming. And although you're saying it in kind of vague ways, we want to pin you down. And I think that's the reason that this accusation was brought up, because I say that because Jesus was silent to them, but in verse number 62, the high priest stood up and said to him, "Do you not answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you?" But Jesus kept silent. And the high priest said to him, "I adjure you by the living God that you tell us whether you are the Christ, the Son of God." Okay, and that's an interesting question in itself, isn't it? I adjure you by the living God. Well, that was the living God standing right in front of them. I adjure you, he could have said by yourself. He was not a believer, of course. And so he's kind of placing Jesus in a position where he has to make an answer because he's made this appeal by the living God. And so Jesus said to him, "You have said it yourself. Nevertheless, I tell you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." And that's when the high priest tears his robes and says, "What further need do we have of any testimony? This man has blasphemed." It might seem as if Jesus, once again, is kind of cloaking the truth in a vague response, "You have said it yourself." But other gospel writers become a little more exact. For example, if we look in Mark's gospel, we see that Jesus' response is recorded by Mark as Jesus said, verse 62 of Mark 14, "I am." The same thing he said in the garden just, a few minutes or a few hours earlier. "I am, and you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds in heaven." And so that's when they tore the robes. And Jesus had made a definitive claim to being the Christ, the Son of the living God. And then he quotes this scripture that was an equal claim to being the Messiah. Okay? And next time we'll look at that scripture that Jesus quoted to show you that there's no doubt this was a definitive claim to be Messiah, promised one of the Old Testament. I'll see you next time.
HeavenWord 7 is made possible by the financial support of viewers like you. Thank you.